Labyrinth is a cult classic, sure, but what happened behind the scenes traumatized its lead star and everyone involved. It's the 1980s. Just weeks before filming begins, a phone rings in a dark apartment at midnight. On the other end of the line was David Bowie, and he sounded furious. He said the script wasn't working, that his character had turned into a caricature, and that if this was the final version of Labyrinth, he was walking away. On the other end of the line was the director, Jim Henson. For him, that threat was a fatal blow. Without Bowie, the movie would lose its biggest commercial draw and become a massive gamble all over again. The problem is, this call didn't come during a quiet moment. The script had already been rewritten over 20 times. Production was already moving forward, and the project was barely hanging by a thread. Labyrinth wasn't just in danger of failing, it was already falling apart. Labyrinth was a real-life maze for the people who made it. For Jim Henson, it was a desperate gamble. He was coming off a flop and was willing to fix whatever it took, even if it meant losing control of his own movie. For David Bowie, it was an unnecessary risk. He had nothing left to prove, yet he still jumped into an unstable project. And for Jennifer Connelly, it was a defining experience. She was barely 14 years old, thrust into the center of a massive production, surrounded by adults, heavy expectations, and real fears. In this video, we're going to explore the production, the filming, the failure, and the eventual redemption of a cult classic, but not in a linear way. We're going to do it by following the paths of these three key figures, crossing their experiences, their conflicts, and the fallout they faced within the very same movie. Because Labyrinth can't be fully understood if you only look at it from one point of view. And maybe that's exactly why it took so long to find its place. Long before he became the Goblin King, David Bowie was already an anomaly in pop culture. From his very first steps, he understood something very few artists do. Identity isn't a fixed thing, it's a creative tool. Born in London in 1947, Bowie was one of the most influential artists of the 20th century. He reached global fame as a singer and songwriter in the early 70s, blending rock, pop, and electronic music with a theatrical aesthetic that was completely groundbreaking for the time. Over time, the public realized what his true magic was. He built characters, universes, and narratives around every album. Ziggy Stardust, The Thin White Duke, The Berlin Traveler. Every era was a new skin, and every skin came with a risk. That constant game with his identity came at a price. For years, Bowie sank into a deeply self-destructive phase. Heavy drug use, paranoia, and isolation pushed him to the brink of collapse. It got to a point where his genius seemed inseparable from his excess. To many, that was just the inevitable price of talent. The breaking point came when he decided to run away from himself. He moved to Berlin, stepped away from the center of the industry, and began a slow, quiet reconstruction. There, he took back control, refined his sound, and for the first time in years, started thinking clearly again. He didn't stop experimenting, but the purpose of that experimentation changed. It was no longer about destroying himself. It was about transforming without fading away in the process. That era marked a fundamental shift in how he chose his projects. Bowie wasn't just looking for shock value or provocation anymore. He was looking for challenges that forced him to see himself from a different angle. Uncomfortable characters, ambiguous figures, and stories that didn't spell everything out. By the mid-1980s, when Labyrinth came along, Bowie was almost 40 and already an established star. He had risen like a phoenix, holding artistic prestige and total freedom to choose which projects to accept and which to turn down. And that's exactly why Labyrinth feels like such an oddity in his career. Because on paper, it didn't fit with anything Bowie had been building. And yet, something in that still unknown project was about to intersect with all those previous choices. But before we get to that phone call, we need to understand another key piece of the puzzle. Because Bowie had already spent years exploring that dangerous territory. Movies. Bowie approached film as someone who saw acting as a natural extension of his music. For the singer, playing a character wasn't much different from adopting an identity on stage. The context changed, but the logic remained the same. Explore the strange, the ambiguous, and the uncomfortable. His serious film debut came with The Man Who Fell to Earth, where he played an isolated, cold, and vulnerable alien. It wasn't a random choice. The character seemed tailor-made for his public image. Someone brilliant, distant, and completely out of place. Years later, he chose a similar path with The Hunger. There, he played an elegant, decadent figure trapped in a dark story. Once again, Bowie leaned toward projects that didn't aim to please everyone, but rather to leave a mark. That approach had consequences. Bowie never became a traditional Hollywood star. He didn't rack up box office hits or lead massive franchises, and he had no interest in doing so either. It was the exact opposite of what he wanted. Any hint of commercial success actually repelled him. Even so, for him to end up in Labyrinth, a director had to hound him for an entire year, until one day he finally had enough. It's the mid-1980s. And David Bowie was bouncing between massive tours, new albums, and film projects that followed his own highly personal logic. The music industry was becoming more spectacular and corporate by the minute, while the movie business was leaning hard into franchises, clear-cut heroes, and proven formulas. In the midst of all this, Bowie stayed in touch with Frank Oz. And pay close attention here, because Oz wasn't just anybody. He was a key figure in modern entertainment, even if he was often invisible to the general public. Oz wasn't just the man who brought Yoda to life in Star Wars. Alongside Jim Henson, he was one of the master architects behind the Muppet universe. Together, they created characters that redefined television, family movies, and pop culture for multiple generations. They were puppeteers, sure, but they were also storytellers, directors, and visionaries capable of turning puppets into global icons. Oz and Henson had spent decades building fantasy worlds, universes filled with creatures where technique, performance, and imagination blended seamlessly, without relying on the few digital shortcuts that existed back then. But Henson's next project was so ambitious that he was ready to cash in every favor he had, along with Oz's. And among all those contacts, the most important one of all was David Bowie. And so, during a casual conversation, Oz mentioned the project to Bowie. He told him there was a director who had been trying to reach him for a while. He wasn't some powerful producer or an executive promising box office gold, but he was obsessed with an idea about handmade fantasy worlds, practical creatures, and a groundbreaking vision that didn't quite fit into the commercial cinema of the time. But to Bowie, this passion barely registered. Pitches like this came his way all the time, and most of them vanished in the exact same conversation they were brought up in. But the weird thing was, Henson's name just wouldn't go away. Weeks would pass and it would pop up again, sometimes through Oz, other times through materials landing straight in his hands, sketches, visual concepts, script drafts. For almost a year, that presence kept growing quietly in the background. Bowie carried on with his schedule, while the industry landscape made the gamble seem more and more unlikely. Fantasy movies weren't exactly having their best moment. Betting on that kind of storytelling was risky, to say the least. And yet, someone kept insisting. Finally, Bowie decided to actually sit down and look at the material. And that was the turning point. The moment he finished reviewing it, he asked for a meeting with this director who had been orbiting his life for months without ever crossing paths. But who was Jim Henson, really? And why did he need David Bowie to say yes so badly? Well, the story is a bit more complex than you might imagine. To understand why Labyrinth became an obsession, you first have to understand who Jim Henson was and where he was in his career. Henson wasn't a rookie director or a creative desperate for validation. He was an established creator who had spent decades working in television and film, forever changing how audiences connected with puppets. Alongside Frank Oz, he had brought the Muppets to life, characters that didn't just dominate TV, but became a centerpiece of pop culture. To the public, Henson was synonymous with family entertainment, and to the industry, he was a sure bet. The problem was, Henson didn't want to stop there. For a while, he felt his work was being pigeonholed into a single tone. He didn't want to be remembered just for the Muppets or the gentle humor people expected from him. He was convinced that puppets could tell more ambitious, darker, and emotionally complex stories. And the big screen was the place to prove it. In 1982, he co-directed The Dark Crystal, a fantasy entirely performed by animatronic creatures. The project was massive, deeply personal, and highly risky. The movie wasn't a disaster, but it wasn't the hit Henson needed either. For a lot of viewers, it was just too weird and grim. The message was clear. He had proven he could do something different, but he couldn't afford to fail again. If he wanted to keep making movies, he had to prove he could combine artistic ambition with commercial success. And that pressure started weighing on him more than he was willing to admit. In that context, a new idea started to take shape. From that place of creative burnout and a quiet fear of failure, Henson accepted an uncomfortable truth. He couldn't succeed alone. He needed a creative partner who understood his vision and could help him shape a new idea. In this point, he turned to Brian Froud. Together, they started building the visual universe of Labyrinth with goblins, grotesque creatures, impossible hallways, and a baby surrounded by monsters. Henson provided the big picture, and Froud translated it into images. The world they were creating was powerful, weird, and deeply personal. The problem was, there still wasn't a clear story. Labyrinth existed as a visual concept long before it had an actual plot. And that was dangerous. Henson knew it. He couldn't just get carried away by his love for fantasy, because if he couldn't deliver an accessible narrative, failure was going to hit him all over again. For years, the project moved forward in fits and starts. Some script drafts leaned heavily into symbolism, others tried to be more kid-friendly, and some completely shifted the focus of the story. Time kept passing, and nothing was really clicking. Even so, Labyrinth stopped being just a visually interesting idea and turned into a necessity. Henson felt this movie simply had to exist, but for that need to become a real opportunity, he needed more than just good ideas. He needed more allies who could actually carry the project. And the first one was about to completely change the scale of the film. In the middle of this creative maze, Jim Henson knew he had hit a wall. He had a powerful visual world, a project in motion, and way too many unresolved drafts of the script. If he wanted Labyrinth to become a real movie, he needed more than just imagination. He needed backing. And that backing came through Frank Oz. Okay, let's do a quick recap. Oz and Henson had been working together for years. They hadn't just created the Muppets. They shared a very specific way of understanding practical fantasy and non-human characters. That bond was the bridge that connected Henson to none other than George Lucas. At the time, Lucas was an untouchable figure. He was coming off the original Star Wars trilogy and was in the middle of producing the Indiana Jones movies. His name didn't just guarantee commercial success, it brought industry credibility, which was exactly what Henson needed after the mixed results of The Dark Crystal. Lucas was captivated by Henson's ideas, and especially by Brian Froud's illustrations. He was drawn to the idea of creating a fantasy world built on practical creatures and physical effects. It was no coincidence. He himself had trusted Oz to bring Yoda to life, one of the most iconic characters in modern cinema. Sold on that approach, Lucas agreed to come on board as a producer for Labyrinth through Lucasfilm Limited. He also brought in his special effects company, Industrial Light and Magic, and played a key role in pulling together a budget of around $25 million. A massive number for that kind of fantasy at the time. Suddenly, Labyrinth went from a fragile project to having real industry muscle behind it. He brought Lucas into the creative process, showed him the endless script drafts, and took several of his suggestions. At the same time, his own company, Jim Henson's Creature Shop, started building the puppets and creatures that would bring that universe to life. But the core problem was still there. While the Hollywood machine was revving up, the story still wasn't locked in. By the time the number of drafts crossed 20, Henson realized the script had become a crisis he couldn't put off any longer. The project was moving forward without a solid foundation. Sets were being built, creatures were taking shape, and the clock was ticking. Every decision made it harder to turn back. The maze was growing, and finding a way out was no longer an option. That's when Henson set a new goal for himself. He wanted a cast full of faces that could draw an audience all on their own. Stars who guaranteed attention, magnetism, and box office returns. And right there, we already know who showed up. Listen to where this story goes next, because it's crazy how Henson went from the lowest point of his career to pulling in George Lucas, hundreds of rising stars, and the biggest singers in history, all with just an unfinished script and a few sketches. Originally, Henson pictured Jareth, the story's antagonist, as a sophisticated puppet, but he quickly realized that wouldn't work. The character needed to project seduction, menace, and genuine emotion. Puppetry and technique weren't enough. He needed real presence. He tossed around a few names and even considered Kevin Kline until he had an epiphany. The Goblin King had to be played by a rock star. It wasn't a random choice. Jareth was meant to be a projection of Sarah's inner turmoil, a figure born straight out of her teenage fantasies. And to embody that ambiguous fascination, who better than a famous musician? Henson thought about several massive pop culture icons of the time: Michael Jackson, Mick Jagger, Sting, Prince, until he remembered David Bowie. As we've already mentioned, Bowie wasn't just a music legend, he also had a solid film career, and exactly the strange magnetism Henson was looking for in Jareth. He could be unsettling, sensual, adult, everything that contrasted with Sarah's innocence. Henson managed to reach out to David Bowie while he was touring the US, but didn't have much success. Until, a year later, he finally landed a meeting. This time, he came prepared. We already saw this story from Bowie's perspective, but Henson's experience was completely different. The director didn't understand why Bowie was suddenly interested in him, but he wasn't about to waste the opportunity. He brought Froud's illustrations, a copy of The Dark Crystal, of a fantasy world unlike anything Bowie had ever seen. The effect was immediate. Bowie was mesmerized by that universe. He wanted to know more, so Henson took the next step and showed him one of the most advanced drafts of Labyrinth. The core premise was already in place. Young Sarah has to rescue her baby brother from the clutches of Jareth, the Goblin King. And to do that, she has to navigate a maze full of surprises. Reading it, Bowie found something he didn't expect. A fantasy that worked as a family movie, but also as a thoughtful, reflective story. His interest grew even more when Henson played his winning card. Bowie wouldn't just act, he would also get to write the songs for the movie. At that moment, Labyrinth became a gamble Henson could no longer afford to lose. So, Had Henson found his Jareth? Yes, but he couldn't let his guard down. Production was still a ways off, and Bowie hadn't signed a contract locking him into the project. At the end of the day, he was still a rock star who could walk away at any moment, so the director agreed to send him every single script revision. Now, the problem was, that script didn't actually exist yet. To settle the issue once and for all, Henson managed to bring in legendary Monty Python writer Terry Jones. He seemed like a godsend for the project, but it ended up being a massive mistake, though the worst was yet to come. The real bombshell would explode after the premiere, with a lawsuit tied to Henson's original ideas, which actually had little to do with Jones. But we'll save that for later. Jones was known for his biting humor and his experience with fantasy. The choice made perfect sense. He could bring a fresh perspective, something more irreverent and less serious. However, the clash was immediate. Jones didn't connect with the existing story and decided to scrap it almost entirely, relying strictly on Brian Froud's concept art. The result was a visually striking script, packed with memorable scenes and fascinating creatures, but narratively all over the place. By the time the new draft was ready, Henson was already deep into building puppets and sets, so he just skimmed it and sent it straight to Bowie. And as we mentioned earlier, the singer called him absolutely furious. He said the story had lost its humor and dragged on with endless dialogue. But what bothered him the most was how his character was written. Jareth was just straight up evil, and ended up turning into a pathetic goblin. Bowie made it clear, if this was the final script, he was walking away from the project right then and there. Henson panicked. Without Bowie, Labyrinth went back to being a massive gamble. The director calmed the star down, assuring him it wasn't the final draft and promising to send a new one. The second he hung up, he called Jones and demanded changes. But after just a few days inside the maze, Terry Jones was already exhausted by the project. Bowie, Henson, and everyone else. He quit, even asking to have his name taken off the credits. Terrified, Henson played his final card. Instead of removing his name, he offered him sole screenwriting credit. The writer couldn't say no and agreed to put together one last draft. As soon as he got it, Henson read it carefully, made sure it delivered everything he and Bowie wanted, and sent it straight to the musician. Within hours, Bowie called him back, absolutely thrilled. He approved the new version, signed on to play Jareth, and wrote 5 songs, including Underground and Magic Dance. Henson was so happy he didn't even care about one minor detail. This was draft number 25, but it didn't matter. He had secured Bowie and cleared his biggest creative hurdle. Now, all that was left was the next challenge, filming. The maze was already built and it was time to dive in and solve it. With puppets, massive sets, a baby, and a global superstar, it wasn't going to be an easy task. When filming for Labyrinth began in April 1985, Henson knew he wasn't dealing with a normal production. The sets were built at Elstree Studios in the UK, and the scale was massive. Complex sets, dozens of creatures, and a crew used to working with pinpoint precision. From the outside, everything looked under control. On the inside, it was a completely different story. The heart of the project was the puppets. Jim Henson's Creature Shop had developed hundreds of creatures, each with its own operating system. But none were as complex as Hoggle, the dwarf who accompanies Sarah. The character required the coordination of several puppeteers at once, with remote-controlled facial movements. Every setup demanded long rehearsals and an exhausting level of synchronization. It worked, but at a massive physical and mental cost. Henson was in his element. No one knew the language of puppets, the timing, and the technical limits better than him. That wasn't the issue. The problem was that, while the most complex part of the project was working, the movie still lacked a completely clear identity. Believe it or not, the script kept being tweaked throughout filming, and a lot of decisions were just made on the fly. Into this environment stepped David Bowie. Henson needed the singer to feel comfortable, involved, and above all, committed. He gave him creative freedom, room to shape Jareth, and time to adapt to a setting completely unlike any other movie set. Bowie handled it well. He was used to extreme costumes, heavy makeup, and building characters from the outside in. Even so, there was an inevitable culture shock. During his early scenes, Bowie realized the creatures he was interacting with weren't speaking from their mouths. The voices were coming from off-camera. They belonged to hidden puppeteers, synced up with surgical precision. It took him a minute to get used to that dynamic, but once he did, he actually started enjoying the challenge. For Henson, striking that balance was crucial. Without Bowie, the movie would be a total flop. Meanwhile, the pressure kept mounting. The clock was ticking, costs were rising, and every single day brought new problems to solve. Even scenes that were supposed to be simple ended up blowing way out of proportion. Take the magic dance sequence, for example. It went from featuring just a handful of puppets to a massive spectacle packed with creatures, actors on wire harnesses, and complex choreography. After 5 grueling months, Henson yelled, "Cut," for the final time. And for the first time in a long while, the director actually believed the worst was behind him. Little did he know, the biggest threat to Labyrinth wasn't on set, or with the puppets, or even with Bowie. It was outside the movie. What came next could keep Labyrinth from ever hitting theaters at all. With filming wrapped, Labyrinth entered a phase that, in theory, should have been much calmer. The danger had been left on the set. Everything pointed to the project finally being ready to face the world, until another unexpected phone call came in. Post-production started off well. Henson showed a rough cut to George Lucas, who had some specific notes on the pacing. They weren't drastic changes, but they were crucial tweaks designed to give the movie a clearer rhythm and, more importantly, make it more accessible to a mainstream audience. The director listened closely. There was no point arguing with the guy who turned franchises into global phenomena. Meanwhile, industrial light and magic played a key role in finishing the matte paintings and polishing the visual look of this fantasy world. Little by little, Labyrinth seemed to be falling into place. By early 1986, Henson locked in a final cut. With the movie finished, a marketing campaign kicked off, leaning hard on its biggest names: Henson himself, Lucas, David Bowie, and the promise of a fantasy unlike anything seen before. But this phone call would change everything. Henson picked up. A team of lawyers demanded an immediate meeting. They represented Maurice Sendak, one of the most famous children's book authors in the world. The director knew exactly who he was, but couldn't understand what the problem could be. The explanation was blunt and alarming. According to the lawyers, the plot of Labyrinth was practically identical to Outside Over There. In that book, a young girl has to rescue her baby sister, who is kidnapped by goblins. Henson tried to stay calm. He admitted he had read Sendak's work, and that the book even appeared in Sarah's bedroom as a visible nod. But he was also clear, he had never tried to copy it. To him, both stories drew from the exact same European legends. The lawyers weren't satisfied. They demanded a more convincing explanation and left a very real threat hanging in the air: a copyright infringement lawsuit. The blow was devastating. Just when it seemed like all the problems were behind them, bad luck was stalking them again. Brian Froud tried to calm him down, pointing out the obvious. Sendak had been inspired by the exact same traditional folktales they were, but that argument, as logical as it was creatively, meant nothing legally. If he didn't find a quick fix, Labyrinth could be tainted, or worse, never hit theaters at all. Henson knew he wasn't in any shape to fight another battle, not after years of burnout, creative clashes, and an exhausting production. So he made a pragmatic choice. He went back to the editing room and added a line to the end credits, acknowledging Sendak's work as an influence. It worked. The lawyers were satisfied. With a single sentence in the credits, the legal dispute was resolved. Labyrinth was no longer in danger of disappearing before its release. Legally, it was safe. Commercially, not yet. Because now came the moment Jim Henson feared most, showing the movie to the very audience that had already rejected him once. But wait, there's something we still haven't talked about. So far, we've gone down two paths: Bowie's and Henson's. There's a third one left, the quietest one. The one who lived this entire story from the inside, with absolutely no control over what was happening. It's time to change the point of view, because out of everyone involved in Labyrinth, there was only one person who was there for the attempt, the failure, the forgotten years, and the eventual redemption. And her name is Jennifer Connelly. Connelly started her career as a child model, which was pretty common in the American entertainment industry back then. That early start paved the way for her jump to the movies. Even though she had already worked with renowned Italian directors, it was Henson's vision that truly catapulted her. Although, she almost didn't take part in the movie at all. The casting process for Labyrinth began in 1984. Several candidates auditioned, including Helena Bonham Carter, Sarah Jessica Parker, Laura Dern, and Marissa Tomei. Henson was actually on the verge of picking someone else when he discovered Connelly and realized he had found exactly what he was looking for.
When you're casting a part like Sarah, you hope someone walks in the door and is the right person. And when Jenny walked in, she was the right person.
The moment he saw her, he was captivated. Aside from having a very all-American presence, she perfectly conveyed the struggles of growing up. He talked to her and noticed she was going through the exact same phase in life as her character. The director was sold, but Connelly didn't fully realize what she was getting into. She wasn't even sure she wanted to be a huge star, or what that really entailed. She was just moving forward, taking things as they came, without knowing yet that Hollywood could be a much darker and more demanding place than it looked from the outside. A real maze full of surprises, both amazing and unpleasant. With more doubts than answers, Connelly found herself at the center of a massive fantasy production. Surrounded by puppets, giant sets, a baby, and a global rock icon, she began the experience that would define her career forever. On this channel, we've seen plenty of cases where child actors go through difficult experiences. Being a kid in Hollywood is never easy, and Jennifer Connelly was no exception. When Labyrinth began filming, Connelly was just 14 years old. While the challenge was technical for Jim Henson and creative for David Bowie, Connelly experienced the production from a completely different place. As a young girl, she accepted the Goblin world exactly as it was presented to her: fantastical, complicated, and dreamlike. Plus, if she wanted to make sure her movie career didn't end on that very set, she had to prove she could handle every single challenge. Carrying the entire movie, acting alongside creatures operated by puppeteers, and dealing with unconventional rules were all part of an experience she just wasn't in a position to question. Because of that, she interacted with the puppets without any hesitation or fear. Unlike Bowie, she reacted to them completely naturally. Looking back, she would later describe that part of the production as something special and immersive. But we can't forget one crucial detail. The script never stopped changing, even while cameras were rolling. Scenes were tweaked on the fly, and she had to learn new lines at the last minute. Luckily for Henson, Connelly adapted quickly, not fully realizing that this kind of dynamic wasn't normal. She only had 2 previous movie credits under her belt, and her fear of failing left no room to voice any discomfort. The production moved forward with adult logic, and she just went along with it, without stopping to think too much about what it all meant. The same went for her scenes with the baby. The timing was unpredictable, and shots had to be constantly adapted, but she accepted those conditions as just part of the job. Being ready the second the camera started rolling became a pressure she took on without question. Ultimately, Henson's stress and Bowie's doubts had very little to do with her experience. Connelly's Labyrinth was different. It was the maze of a young girl immersed in a fantasy world, not unlike her own character. When filming wrapped, she felt satisfied. She believed she had conquered the challenge. But that wasn't the real Labyrinth. In her case, the worst was yet to come. It didn't take long for her to realize the problem would surface later. During the marketing campaign, Labyrinth began to circulate as an ambiguous fantasy. It wasn't a traditional kids' movie, but it wasn't exactly made for adults either. That lack of definition carried over directly into the public's perception of Jennifer. Her image began to be weighed down by interpretations she hadn't chosen and didn't even understand at the time. The industry and the public projected a maturity onto her that didn't match her actual age. Once the movie premiered, that weight became impossible to ignore. When Labyrinth hit theaters in June 1986, the reaction was cold. The movie debuted far from the top of the US box office and dropped off quickly in the following weeks. Reviews were mixed. Some praised its visual ambition, while others questioned the story and most of all its confusing tone. For the industry, the verdict was simple and harsh. Labyrinth had failed. For Jennifer Connelly, the impact was immediate. At just 15, she was now associated with an expensive blockbuster that failed to break even. In Hollywood, that kind of reputation carries weight, even for someone so young. Opportunities began to dry up, roles became more vague, and her transition into adulthood grew complicated. From that point on, something shifted in the way the industry looked at her. Her image began to be viewed through an uncomfortable lens. She was seen less as an actress and valued more and more for her appearance. People started projecting a level of maturity onto her that didn't match her real age. It wasn't her choice, and it wasn't something she could control, but it deeply shaped the direction of her career during those years. Meanwhile, the rest of the team was facing their own fallout. Jim Henson was devastated by the failure, and he couldn't even find comfort in his biggest creative ally. During that same period, George Lucas was dealing with a similar disappointment with Howard the Duck. The atmosphere wasn't about learning lessons or course correcting, it was about shared defeat. And for Henson, it didn't just hurt because of the money or the lost opportunities. He felt like he had dragged too many people down with him: a rock icon, a teenage actress just starting out, and even his best friend's young son. At the time, no one could have guessed it. But just like in the movie itself, the story wasn't over yet. There was still one last twist. Away from the theaters, Labyrinth found a second life, first on rent movies, then on television, and later through new generations who discovered it without the baggage of its original release. The movie began to circulate, being shared, reinterpreted, and defended. What had once been seen as a flaw became its greatest strength. Over time, Labyrinth shifted from flop to cult classic. And in that process, the roles of Jennifer, Henson, and Bowie were recast. Bit by bit, the team saw that the movie was living a second life, far from the box office. It was found by kids who never saw it on the big screen, fantasy lovers who discovered it late, and David Bowie fans who had initially dismissed it as too childish. Now, without the pressure of a premiere or ticket sales, everyone connected with Sarah's journey, Jareth's magnetic presence, the goblins, and above all, the labyrinth as a metaphor for growing up. Henson didn't have much time to enjoy this revival. He passed away in 1990 at the age of 53, a loss that shook popular culture and made his legacy even larger. Bowie, for his part, maintained his status as a bold musical icon and continued appearing in major films until his death in 2016. As for Connelly, her career also found a new path. It took 15 years for her to regain her standing in the industry. Jennifer rebuilt herself through different choices, demanding roles, and a quieter but more solid trajectory. Time gave her something Hollywood had denied her at the start: perspective. Today, she can look back with pride at how Labyrinth became a cult masterpiece. The final irony is this: the only person who lived to see the whole story, the attempt, the blow, the years of being forgotten, and the ultimate redemption, was Jennifer Connelly. While the others left too soon, she stayed long enough to prove that sometimes losing isn't the end. Sometimes it's just the first step toward becoming something that immediate success never would have allowed. Labyrinth was born from a visionary who wanted to win over the world. Just like its protagonist, it had incredible allies and faced daunting obstacles and villains. The film's initial failure didn't stop it from rising like a phoenix. Above all, it reminds us that fantasy works just as well for escaping reality as it does for making us think. The Oscars are dead. Back in 1998, almost 60 million people tuned in to watch the ceremony. By 2021, that number dropped to just 9 million.